Her light when respect is earned back. Her daughter-in-law grabbed the serving spoon right from her trembling hands, announcing to the entire dinner table that she would eaten plenty already. Dorothy Chen, 68-year-old retired nurse and grandmother, didn't say a word. Her son Kevin just stared at his phone while the room filled with uncomfortable silence. By sunrise, their names would be removed from her property deed, her bank accounts, and every legal document they would manipulated. She would trusted them with her home once. Now she was reclaiming it. And when they tried to fight back, the sheriff would be waiting at breakfast. We are just getting started. But first, tell me where you are watching from tonight. Knowing this story reaches real people in real places gives it power beyond these words. Drop your location in the comments, and make sure to hit that subscribe button for her light. The cranberry sauce was still warm in the crystal bowl when it happened. I was reaching for just a small second helping, my arthritic fingers wrapped carefully around the silver spoon, when Melissa shot across the table like a striking snake and snatched it away. That is quite enough for tonight, Grandma Dorothy, she announced with that saccharine smile that never touched her cold eyes. The entire dining room froze. Uncle Robert's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My granddaughter Sarah looked up from cutting her turkey, confusion spreading across her teenage face. Even little Tommy in his booster seat seemed to sense something awful had just cracked the air like thunder. But my son Kevin, my own flesh and blood, just kept scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. Not a glance, not a word, just that familiar shoulder shrug that told me he would heard everything and chosen silence. Melissa placed my spoon down with deliberate ceremony, wiping her manicured hands on her cloth napkin, like she would just handled something distasteful. Some of us are still working on our first plates, she said, with a laugh that bounced off the walls and died in the corners. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling them shake, despite my best efforts to stay composed. My voice would have cracked if I would tried to speak, so I didn't. Instead, I stood slowly, smoothing down my navy dress that I would picked specifically because Kevin once said it made me look dignified. "Excuse me for a moment," I whispered. Though nobody was listening anymore, conversation had already resumed around me like I was a brief interruption, rather than the woman who would spent 3 days preparing this feast. I walked through the hallway lined with family photos that Melissa had slowly been replacing with abstract art and motivational quotes. The kitchen still smelled like sage and butter, but it felt foreign now, like visiting a museum of my former life. I stepped onto the back porch where the October air bit through my sweater and reminded me I was still breathing, still here, still capable of feeling something other than invisible. When I came back inside, I didn't return to my seat at the foot of the table where Melissa had demoted me from the head position I would held for 40 years. Instead, I went to my small bedroom at the back of the house, to the cedar chest that held more than winter blankets. Underneath my late husband Frank's old fishing magazines, I found the manila folder I would prayed I would never need to open. The papers inside were crisp and official, bearing my name in bold black letters, Dorothy M. Chen, primary deed holder and life estate grantor. My heart steadied as I read the familiar legal language that Frank and I had crafted with our attorney when we would gifted the house to Kevin and Melissa 5 years ago. But it wasn't a gift without conditions. No, we would been smarter than that. It was a revocable life estate with full restoration rights. My signature was the key to everything, and they would never bothered to read the fine print. I pressed the document against my chest and whispered to the empty room, "Let's see how much you have had when I take back what is mine." It was the kind of grateful tears you rarely see in grown men, especially from your own son. "Mom, are you absolutely certain about this?" Kevin had asked 5 years ago, voice thick with emotion as I handed him the brass house key that had hung on my kitchen hook for 30 years. I would smiled and nodded, ignoring the sharp pain in my chest as I watched him examine our family home with new owner's eyes. This wasn't just 4 walls and a mortgage. This was where he would learn to ride his bicycle, where Frank had taught him to change a tire, where we would celebrated every birthday and holiday and graduation. But I would convinced myself it was the right thing to do. a mother's final gift to help her son build his future. We will treasure it always. Melissa had chimed in that afternoon, her arms wrapped around Kevin's waist, looking up at the house like she was already planning renovations. And we will take wonderful care of you too, she would added, though her eyes were calculating square footage rather than making promises. The only condition Frank and I had insisted on was that I would keep my bedroom and the small sitting area, my corner of independence, where I could maintain some dignity and privacy. They would agreed enthusiastically, signing papers and shaking hands, and talking about how wonderful it would be to have 3 generations under one roof. Now, 5 years later, my presence in this house felt like an inconvenience they were too polite to mention directly. Melissa's touches were everywhere. Cold, modern fixtures replacing the warm lamps Frank had installed. Family photos disappearing in favor of blank canvases and inspirational quotes about living your best life. My reading chair had vanished one day while I was at my doctor's appointment. It was falling apart. Melissa had explained with that patient tone she used when speaking to children. I donated it to someone who could actually use it. The garden I would tended for 30 years was now a rock landscape with geometric patterns and no flowers. Too much maintenance, Melissa claimed, though she had time for daily yoga classes and 3 harsh shopping trips with her sister. Even my kitchen had been transformed. The recipes I would handwritten and taped inside cabinet doors were gone, replaced with printed labels in Melissa's precise handwriting. My spice rack had been organized according to her system, which meant I could never find anything anymore. I would become a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around rules I would never agreed to, asking permission to use spaces I would cleaned and decorated and loved for decades. And Kevin said nothing. He would developed an impressive ability to be absent even when physically present, scrolling through his phone while his wife systematically erased his mother from their shared living space. I started keeping a journal, a small notebook hidden under my mattress where I recorded each slight, each casual cruelty, each moment when I felt my existence being minimized. The 3rd of October, Melissa changed my doctor's appointment without asking, said she knows my schedule better than I do. The 7th of October found my photo albums in a box in the garage. When asked, Melissa said they were cluttering the shelves, and we needed space for her book collection. The 15th of October, Kevin left for his business trip, without saying goodbye. Used to hug me and promised to bring back something special. Now I learn about his travel from overhearing phone calls. My only refuge was the early morning hours before Melissa emerged for her smoothie routine and yoga videos. I would sit in my chair by the window, watching the sunrise paint the neighbors' houses gold, and remember when this house felt like home, instead of a carefully managed institution. Last week, I overheard Melissa on the phone with someone, her voice carrying through the thin walls she would insisted on when they renovated. She is becoming more difficult to manage, Melissa was saying, unaware that I was folding laundry just outside the door. The memory issues are getting worse, and honestly, Kevin travels too much to deal with this properly. I have been researching some very nice assisted living communities. The one in Riverside has excellent reviews, and it is only 20 minutes away. She would probably be happier around people her own age. I would stood frozen in the hallway, a towel clutched to my chest, listening to my future being planned by someone who had known me for exactly 5 years, and understood me not at all. That night, I would pulled out the legal documents, Frank, and I had so carefully prepared, reading them by lamplight, like studying for the most important test of my life. The language was clear, unambiguous, protective. We would thought of everything, including the possibility that generosity might be mistaken for weakness. I called Margaret Wilson the next morning. She would been Frank's attorney for 20 years before she became mine. A sharp woman in her 70s who understood that age didn't equal incompetence. Dorothy Chen, she would said warmly when she heard my voice. What can I do for you today, Margaret? I would said quietly. I think it is time I exercised my rights under the life estate agreement. There had been a pause, then a sound that might have been Margaret settling back in her chair. Are you certain that is what you want? Once we start this process, there is no pretending things can go back to the way they were. I would looked around my bedroom, noting how small it seemed now. How the walls felt like they were closing in rather than embracing me. "Margaret," I would said firmly, "I want my house back." Within 2 days, I had copies of every document. Every clause highlighted and annotated. Margaret had reminded me that the revocable life estate meant exactly what it sounded like. I could revoke it at any time, for any reason, with 30 days' notice. I opened a new folder and began documenting everything. Photos of my belongings that had disappeared, screenshots of text messages where Melissa discussed my mental decline with her friends, recordings of conversations where my capabilities were questioned, despite my clean bill of health from Dr. Patricia Stone just last month. Under one tab, I filed the grocery receipts, showing how my food budget had been absorbed into their general expenses. Under another, the Medicare letters that had been redirected to Melissa's email address without my knowledge or consent. The most damning evidence was the medication management system Melissa had implemented. A locked box where she doled out my pills like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with aspirin. Dr. Stone had specifically noted in my file that I required no cognitive assistance with medication management. But Melissa had ignored that professional assessment in favor of her own assumptions. Kevin remained oblivious to most of this systematic marginalization. Or perhaps he would simply chosen willful blindness. When I would try to discuss my concerns with him, he would patted my shoulder and said, "Mom, Melissa's just trying to help. You know how much she cares about you." But caring and controlling weren't the same thing, though explaining that to Kevin would require him to listen. Really listen for longer than his attention span seemed to allow these days. I tested my theory one evening by mentioning that I would like to host Thanksgiving dinner myself this year, the way I had for 37 years before Melissa took over. Kevin had barely looked up from his laptop. "Mom, that is a lot of work. Melissa's got it all planned out already. Just relax and let us handle it." Just relax, as if I were an invalid rather than a woman who had managed holiday dinners for decades before. Melissa learned how to properly roast a turkey. That is when I knew for certain that this wasn't about my welfare or my happiness. This was about convenience, control, and the gradual erasure of my authority in my own home. Margaret had been right. There was no going back to pretending this was a healthy family arrangement. The morning after the Thanksgiving humiliation, I sat in Margaret's office with my folder of evidence spread across her mahogany desk. She reviewed each document carefully, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When she reached the section about Melissa's plans for assisted living placement, she looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Dorothy, this constitutes attempted financial exploitation and unauthorized guardianship planning. If you want to proceed with reclaiming your property, you have extensive grounds." I nodded, feeling steadier than I had in months. "I want them out, Margaret. Both of them. This is my home, and I will not be managed like an inconvenient problem anymore." Margaret smiled, the kind of expression that probably made opposing lawyers nervous. "Dorothy, we are going to do more than get your house back. We are going to make sure they understand exactly what they have lost through their own actions." The paperwork was filed that afternoon. Notice of life estate revocation, effective in 30 days. Kevin and Melissa would have exactly 1 month to find alternative housing and remove their belongings from my property. But that was just the beginning. Margaret also filed complaints with Adult Protective Services regarding the unauthorized medication management and financial manipulation, and she would contacted the district attorney's office about the Medicare redirect and the forged signatures on several documents I would never seen before. "These aren't just family disputes," Margaret explained, as she organized the filing copies. "These are potential felonies dressed up as caregiving." I drove home slowly that afternoon, seeing my neighborhood with new eyes. These were my streets, my neighbors, my community where I would lived and worked and raised my family for 40 years. Melissa and Kevin had treated it like a temporary convenience. But for me, it was the foundation of everything I would build with Frank. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself for the first time in months. Nothing elaborate, just scrambled eggs and toast. But I ate it at my own pace without commentary, about portion sizes or nutritional content. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank and I had shared thousands of meals, and I felt his presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. We did good. Frank, I whispered to the empty room. We protected ourselves even when we thought we were just being generous. The certified letter was delivered the next morning while Kevin was at work and Melissa was at her Pilates class. I signed for it myself, thanking the postal worker who had been delivering to this address since before Melissa was born. Inside was the official notice, stamped and sealed, informing them that their residency was terminated, and they had 30 days to vacate. Margaret had included a cover letter explaining that any attempt to contest the revocation would result in additional legal action regarding the documented exploitation and fraud. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter, where Melissa always left her shopping lists and workout schedules. Then I went to my room and waited. The explosion came at 4:17 p.m. I heard Melissa's car in the driveway, her heels clicking across the hardwood. Then a silence that stretched for several long minutes before the screaming began. "Kevin, Kevin, get home right now! Your mother has lost her mind." I stayed in my room, listening to her pace and rant and make frantic phone calls. When Kevin arrived 20 minutes later, his voice was lower but equally agitated. "How is this even possible? I thought the house was ours. It was supposed to be," Melissa shrieked. "This is insane. She cannot just kick us out. We have invested thousands of dollars in improvements that I would never requested and often actively disliked, but I didn't interrupt their crisis to point that out." The knock on my bedroom door came an hour later, Kevin's voice controlled but strained. "Mom, can we talk?" I opened the door to find both of them standing in the hallway, Melissa's face blotchy with tears and rage, Kevin looking like he would aged 5 years since morning. "Mom," Kevin began, "there has to be some mistake. We can work this out." I looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing Frank's eyes and nose, but none of Frank's integrity or strength. "There is no mistake, Kevin. I am reclaiming my home." "But where are we supposed to go?" Melissa demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that probably alarmed the neighbors. "That is not my problem to solve," I replied calmly. "You are both adults with jobs and options. I am sure you will figure something out." Kevin stepped forward, trying his practiced charm. "Mom, I know Melissa can be a little intense sometimes. But we are family. We can talk through whatever's bothering you, a little intense." 5 years of systematic marginalization reduced to a personality quirk. "Kevin," I said, my voice steady as bedrock, "you sat at that dinner table last night and watched your wife humiliate me in front of our entire family. You didn't say a word. You didn't even look up from your phone." His face flushed. "That is not. It wasn't that serious. It was serious to me, and it was the last straw in a very long pattern of disrespect that you have chosen to ignore." Melissa pushed past Kevin, her perfectly applied makeup now streaked with mascara. "You ungrateful old woman. Do you have any idea what we have sacrificed to take care of you? The time, the money, the inconvenience?" I smiled, feeling calmer than I had in years. "Melissa, I never asked you to take care of me. I asked you to share my home with respect and kindness. You managed neither." Over the next week, I watched them scramble to find housing and pack their belongings. Kevin tried several more attempts at reconciliation, offering compromises and apologies that felt more like negotiations than genuine remorse. Melissa alternated between tearful pleas about family loyalty and angry threats about legal action that Margaret assured me were completely baseless. "They cannot fight a revocable life estate," Margaret explained during one of our check-in calls. "It is like trying to argue against gravity. The law is absolutely clear." I spent those days reclaiming my space, room by room. I moved my reading chair back from wherever Melissa had banished it, hung my family photos back on the walls, and threw away her motivational quotes about living your best life. In the kitchen, I removed her organizational labels and put my recipes back inside the cabinet doors where they belonged. I bought new spices and arranged them the way I preferred, by frequency of use rather than alphabetical order. The garden would take longer to restore, but I spent hours outside planning, where I would plant my roses and herbs come spring. The geometric rock patterns would be gone, replaced with the kind of flower beds that attracted butterflies and birds and filled the air with sweetness. On moving day, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching Kevin load boxes into a rented truck. He moved slowly, like each item weighed more than it should, stopping occasionally to stare at the house like he was trying to memorize it. Melissa supervised from the driveway, checking items off lists and directing the process with the same managerial efficiency she would applied to controlling my life. She didn't look at me even once. When they were finished, Kevin walked to the porch steps but didn't climb them. "Mom," he said quietly, "I hope you will be happy here alone." I studied his face, looking for any sign of understanding, any recognition of what had brought us to this moment. "Kevin, I was alone long before today. At least now it is honest." He flinched, just slightly, but I caught it. For a moment, I thought he might say something real, something that acknowledged his part in allowing my marginalization. Instead, he turned and walked to the truck. Melissa called out from the passenger seat, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. "Don't expect us to come running when you fall down those stairs or forget to take your medication." I waved cheerfully. "I will try to manage somehow." That evening, I walked through every room of my house, flipping light switches and opening windows to let in fresh air. The silence felt different now, peaceful rather than oppressive. This was the quiet of contentment, not isolation. I made myself a proper dinner, pot roast with vegetables, and ate it at the dining room table with my grandmother's china and cloth napkins. I lit candles and poured myself a glass of wine and toasted my empty house. To Frank, I said aloud, "For being smart enough to protect me even after you were gone." The legal aftermath came swiftly. Margaret's complaints to Adult Protective Services resulted in an investigation that validated every concern I would documented. The Medicare fraud was referred to federal prosecutors, though Margaret warned me that bureaucratic justice moved slowly. More immediately satisfying was the restraining order that prevented Kevin and Melissa from contacting me or approaching the property without permission. I would specifically requested that clause after Melissa's increasingly unhinged text messages about taking me to court for elder abuse. Let them try. Margaret had laughed. I would love to present our evidence to a judge, but they didn't try. Perhaps their own attorney had explained the futility of their position, or perhaps Kevin finally understood that actions have consequences. 2 months later, I received a brief letter from Kevin, postmarked from an apartment complex across town. "Mom, I hope you are doing well. I think about you often, and I am sorry things ended the way they did. Maybe someday we can talk." I read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Someday was a possibility, but it would require more than a vague apology and wishful thinking. It would require Kevin to acknowledge what he would allow to happen and take responsibility for his own choices. Meanwhile, I was rediscovering the joy of living without constant judgment or micromanagement. I joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the animal shelter, and signed up for a painting class at the community center. My neighbor, Rose Martinez, began stopping by for coffee on Tuesday mornings. She would live 2 houses down for 15 years, but Melissa had always found excuses to avoid socializing with the neighbors. "I always wondered about you," Rose admitted during one of our visits. "You seemed so quiet the last few years. Not like the woman who used to wave from her garden every morning." I would almost forgotten that version of myself, the woman who had been confident and social and unafraid to take up space in her own life. Getting her back felt like coming home to myself. The house began to feel alive again. I played music during the day, cooked elaborate meals just because I enjoyed the process, and stayed up late reading in my reclaimed living room. Every choice was mine to make, every space was mine to use as I pleased. Margaret called periodically to update me on the legal proceedings, but mostly to check on my well-being. "Dorothy, you sound happier every time we talk," she observed during one conversation. "I feel like myself again," I told her. I didn't realize how much I would disappeared until I came back. Spring arrived early that year, and I threw myself into garden planning with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. I ordered rose bushes and herb seedlings, sketched layouts for flower beds, and researched the best methods for removing decorative rocks. On a warm April morning, I was kneeling in the dirt, pulling up the last of Melissa's geometric barriers, when I found something unexpected. Buried beneath the rocks was a small time capsule that Frank and I had planted when Kevin was 8 years old. Inside the metal box, protected by plastic bags, were drawings Kevin had made of our family, photos from a vacation to the coast, and a letter Frank had written to our future selves. His handwriting brought tears to my eyes as I read his hopes for our retirement, his plans for travel and hobbies and time with grandchildren. Most prophetically, he would written, "I hope Dorothy knows how strong she is, even when she has to prove it to people who should already understand." I sat in my reclaimed garden, surrounded by fresh soil and endless possibilities, and felt Frank's wisdom settling around me like a warm shawl. He would know that strength sometimes required solitude, that love sometimes demanded boundaries, and that protecting yourself wasn't selfish when others refused to protect you. That afternoon, I wrote my own letter to the future and buried it in the spot where I planned to plant my memorial rosebush for Frank. In it, I documented this year of reclamation, this season of remembering my own worth, this chapter of choosing peace over people-pleasing. The roses I planted that spring bloomed more beautifully than any I would grown before. The pink ones climbed the trellis Frank had built, the yellow ones spread along the fence line, and the deep red memorial bush became the centerpiece of my renewed garden. Neighbors began stopping to admire the transformation, and several asked for gardening advice. I found myself hosting informal coffee mornings for women in the neighborhood, sharing plant cuttings and life stories with equal generosity. One morning, Rose brought her sister Elena, who had recently been widowed and was struggling with her adult children's attempts to manage her finances and living arrangements. As Elena described her situation, I recognized the familiar pattern of loving family members who confused care with control. "You have more power than you think," I told her gently. "Sometimes we just need to remember how to use it." I connected Elena with Margaret, who helped her establish clear boundaries with her well-meaning but overreaching children. Within 6 months, Elena had regained control of her bank accounts and made it clear that loving concern didn't include making decisions for her without consultation. My coffee group grew to include 8 regular members, all women over 60, who had discovered that supporting each other was more effective than suffering in polite silence. We called ourselves the Tuesday Morning Truth Tellers, and we made it our mission to help each other maintain dignity and autonomy in a world that often treated age like incompetence. Margaret joined us occasionally, providing legal information and resources. "You women are doing something important here," she told us during one visit. "You are refusing to be invisible." On the first anniversary of my house reclamation, I hosted a celebration dinner for my Tuesday group and a few other friends I would reconnected with during my year of rediscovering myself. The dining room table was set with my best china, flowers from my garden, and candles that cast everything in warm, golden light. As we shared stories and laughter, I looked around at the faces of women who understood that growing older didn't mean growing smaller, that wisdom earned the right to be heard, and that kindness was never the same as weakness. Rose raised her glass for a toast. "To Dorothy, who showed us all that home isn't just where you live, it is where you are respected." I accepted their applause with gratitude, but privately, I knew that the greatest victory wasn't getting my house back. It was getting myself back, the confident woman who had somehow been buried under years of accommodation and compromise. The doorbell rang during dessert, and I excused myself to answer it, expecting perhaps a neighbor drawn by the sounds of celebration. Instead, I found Kevin standing on my porch, holding a small potted plant and looking older than his 43 years. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I hope it is okay that I stopped by. I brought you something for your garden." I looked at the plant, a small rose bush with tight buds that would bloom white with pink edges. It was exactly the variety I would mentioned, loving during a garden tour we would taken together years ago, before Melissa had decided that my interests were irrelevant. "It is beautiful, Kevin," I said, accepting the pot. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" He hesitated, glancing past me into the house that had once been his home. "Are you sure? I know you have company." "They are friends," I said, opening the door wider. Women who understand that respect is the foundation of every relationship worth maintaining. Kevin stepped inside, and I saw him taking in the changes. The return of family photos and warm colors and the comfortable furniture that Melissa had tried to erase. His eyes lingered on his own childhood pictures, back in their places of honor. "The house looks," he paused, searching for words. "It looks like home again." I led him to the kitchen, where we sat at the table where he would done homework and eaten countless meals, and learned the difference between right and wrong, though he would seem to forget some of those lessons along the way. "Kevin," I said gently, "why are you really here?" He stared at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with regret. "Melissa left me 3 months ago. Turns out I wasn't managing her well enough either." I waited, letting him find his words without rushing or judging. "She said I was weak for not standing up to you. And then she said I was disloyal for not fighting harder to get the house back. I couldn't win." He looked up at me, and I saw the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "I am sorry, Mom. I am sorry I let her treat you that way. And I am sorry I treated you that way. I lost sight of who you really are." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "Kevin, I never stopped loving you. But I couldn't keep allowing myself to be diminished in the name of keeping peace." "I know," he whispered. "I understand that now, maybe too late. But I understand." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the laughter from the dining room, where my friends were sharing stories and building the kind of community that nourished rather than depleted. "Would it be possible," Kevin asked, hesitantly, "for us to maybe have coffee sometimes? Not here, I know this is your space now, but maybe at that cafe downtown where we used to go when I was in college?" I smiled, remembering those Saturday morning conversations when Kevin was young and earnest and full of dreams that didn't include marginalizing his mother. "I would like that," I said, "but Kevin, any relationship we rebuild has to be based on mutual respect. I will not be managed or minimized, not by you or anyone else." "I understand," he said quickly. "I want to know the woman you have become, not try to control her." Before he left, I walked him through my garden, showing him the roses and herbs and vegetables I would planted in soil that had been barren under Melissa's decorative rocks. He listened without offering suggestions or improvements, just appreciating what I would created. "Dad would love this," he said, touching a leaf on Frank's memorial rose. "He does love it," I corrected gently. "Some things transcend physical presence." Kevin hugged me goodbye carefully, as if afraid I might disappear if he held too tightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me entirely," he whispered. I watched him drive away, then returned to my friends, who asked no questions but simply made space for me to rejoin their celebration. These women understood that healing happens in its own time, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that some relationships are worth rebuilding, while others are worth releasing. Later that evening, after my guests had gone home and I would clean the dishes and put away the china, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and listened to the night sounds of my neighborhood. The crickets and distant traffic and wind through the roses created a symphony of contentment that I would almost forgotten was possible. My phone buzzed with a text message from one of my Tuesday morning friends. "Thank you for showing us that it is never too late to reclaim your life. See you next week." I smiled and typed back, "See you Tuesday. Bring Elena. I have some mint cuttings for her." The roses Frank and I had planted decades ago were blooming again, stronger and more beautiful than ever after surviving Melissa's attempt to erase them. Like me, they would endured a season of burial and emerged more resilient, more vibrant, more determined to flourish. As I prepared for bed in the house that was truly mine again, I felt Frank's presence in every room, heard his voice in every settling board, saw his smile in every family photo back in its rightful place. "We did it, Frank," I whispered to the darkness. "We protected what mattered most." The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I could open as wide as I pleased. In a house where every decision was mine to make, surrounded by a life I would reclaim one choice at a time. I made coffee as strong as I liked it, played music as loud as I enjoyed it, and sat in my garden planning the next season of growth. At 68, I was finally learning that respect isn't something you earn through compliance or lose through aging. Respect is something you demand, maintain, and model, especially for the women watching from the margins, wondering if their voices still matter, if their lives still have value, if it is possible to choose dignity over peace at any age. The answer, blooming all around me in roses and friendships and reclaimed spaces, was absolutely yes. What do you think about Dorothy's journey? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your self-respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to her light for more stories about women who refuse to be invisible. Sometimes the most powerful revolution happens one boundary at a time.